There is a major effort taking place to curb free speech in this country, irrespective of our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. And free speech advocates say the United Nations has come down on precisely the wrong side. The United Nations has adopted what it calls a resolution combating defamation of religions. The United Nations now wants to make that Anti-Blasphemy Resolution binding on member nations, including, of course, our own. That would make it a crime in the United States if the United Nations were to have its way to criticize religion, in particular, Islam. Kitty Pilgrim has our report.
The UN General Assembly is considering a binding resolution urging member states to make it a crime to criticize Islam.
What they would do would be to make it illegal to put out a movie or write a book or a poem which somebody could say was defamatory of Islam.
The so-called Anti-Blasphemy Resolution would call on governments to pass their own laws to determine what can be said about religion in public. The resolution urges states to provide within their respective legal and constitutional systems adequate protection against acts of hatred, discrimination, intimidation, and coercion resulting from defamation of religion. But the U.S. says the concept of defamation of religion has another meaning. While appearing in name to promote tolerance, the implementation of this concept actually fosters intolerance and has served to justify restrictions on human rights and fundamental freedoms. Even talking about the influence of Islam on terrorism could be called criminal under this resolution if adopted by an individual country.
You are entitled to say that in America, but not if the UN has its way. They would criminalize that kind of practice, and they are trying to do it elsewhere around the world.
A group of 57 Organization of Islamic Countries, the largest bloc at the United Nations, has been pushing it out of concern, it says, over anti-Islamic behavior, saying this resolution is a major step towards sensitizing the international community on the serious impact of defamation of religions. Last December, the General Assembly passed it as a non-binding resolution. And this year, a binding resolution is expected to be introduced as early as March. Human rights activists say its influence is already being felt.
There have been a number of prominent cases, most recently in India, for instance, the editor of a newspaper was charged for reprinting an article that had initially been printed in the UK.
While the article mentioned the three major religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the editor was arrested for, quote, hurting the religious feelings of Muslims. Now, essentially what this resolution would do is to urge countries to pass laws in their country which would be unconstitutional in the United States and basically violate the spirit of many Western judicial systems, Lou.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One is, of those 57 nations supporting this resolution, how many of them are democracies?
I couldn't tell you, but many of them are Islamic countries. Pakistan has led the charge on this and has tabled this resolution.
So they're not democracies, and they're fascinated with their own precepts about what would constitute the way to run a nation, not like ours. Is there any discussion, or perhaps of simply, if the United Nations insists on doing this, sort of bulldozing the building, getting it out of the way, and letting them go find another place to live?
It wasn't really discussed in my my discussions today.
Well, perhaps we can raise that as an alternative to impinging on our constitutional liberties. Kitty Pilgrim, thank you very much. Appreciate it. From the United Nations. What a place. Well, joining me now with more on the UN effort to stifle free speech, to squelch it, really, is Christopher Hitchens. He's Vanity Fair columnist, author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Christopher, I have to say, first, welcome. Great to have you back with us. Secondly, how dare these people attempt such a thing?
Well, first, thank you for having me back. And second, look, the claim of Islam is that it is the last and final revelation from God to humanity. That's quite a big claim to make, that you don't need another book after the Quran. You don't need any more evidence. You don't need any more argument. It's all done for you. Now, that's okay if people want to claim that. But now they want to say, if you have any difficulty with this idea, if you have any doubts about it, you're not allowed to express them. Because if you do, you are insulting us. You're making us feel hurt. Now, just imagine those two claims put together. One, a fantastic claim, and the other, a fantastic claim that you can't challenge. That is totalitarianism defined. It's a rape and butchery of the First Amendment of our Constitution.
It's also being joined, though, Christopher, by a lot of nations that are not Islamic, and there seems to be a strong move forward, and it's already, in point of fact, been approved at this level by the United Nations. I have to say that we're reaching a point in the United States where we've got a group of people who will go around clucking, saying, oh, yes, this will be just fine, irrespective of our constitutional rights, because there's some, we have Americans now. There is a movement afoot in this country for hidebound orthodoxy of all sorts of extremes, politically, religiously, in which people say, the heck with the Constitution, there are higher issues at order here.
You're quite right about that. I mean, when Salman Rushdie was sentenced to death by a senile theocrat in Iran for writing a novel, the Archbishop of Canterbury, His Holiness the Pope, certainly the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, and many other religious figures joined with Khomeini, not in exactly endorsing the fatwa, the death sentence, but in saying the problem was blasphemy. That they agreed with the Ayatollah to that extent. The problem was not the destruction of free speech and free expression, but the hurt feelings of the religious. This is a common problem. In Britain, there's a blasphemy law that only protects Christians, for example. It's a big source of Muslim grievance. But when you clear away all these discrepancies, there's one overwhelming thing that's happening, and it's this. There are Muslims who are prepared to use violence at the drop of a hat if a cartoon is published in Denmark, if the Pope makes an off-the-cuff remark, a stupid one in my opinion, about Byzantium or the Crusades. They go straight to violence, but yet you cannot criticize them for being violent lest you be accused of blasphemy.
Yeah, and it is well, Islam, of course, Christianity, whatever it may be. The United Nations is getting a bit burdensome, it seems to me, to anyone who's interested in freedom. Whether it be through the World Trade Organization, whether it be all sorts of institutions, organizations, ranging in issue from global warming to anti-blasphemy.
Yes.
This is becoming a totalitarian, authoritarian organization. And political correctness is really an effort to control, more seemingly to me at least, nothing more than an effort to control thought.
Nothing to do with its remit either, which is the settlement of disputes among member states by peaceful means. Of course, nothing to do with that at all. And remember, thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, all member states or applicants for membership of the UN were not compelled, but were strongly urged to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, among other things, protects freedom of expression. And the countries that refused could still join, but remember that they were the then Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia. Those were the countries that said we would rather not have to think of universal human rights. Universal human rights exist, whether religion recognizes them or not. And we have to stand up for this. Yeah. And we have to better start standing up for it now, I would say, against theocracy.
Well, let me ask you, in the course of the last several days, to my knowledge, I've been the only one in the national, I will put it this way, electronic media that has challenged Reverend Al Sharpton on the issue of the First Amendment, seeking the firing and actually the intervention of the federal government on the New York Post because of a cartoon that was lame, as I've said, insensitive, and I thought demonstration of bad judgment, but not racist. Where in the world has the national liberal media been on that issue?
It was a very crummy cartoon, I have to say.
Absolutely.
But I can't imagine what they were doing. It wasn't... another crime, by the way, it wasn't funny. I mean, can we just say that that's also an offense?
I started out with lame.
Extreme, yeah. Being unfunny is a fantastic failure in a cartoonist.
And I think we should have people's heads well for every time they don't perform.
The federal government has no competence in these matters.
Right.
And it can't be solicited for this event. Now, just scroll back a bit. I've been to Friday prayers in Tehran. Right. Several times.
Christopher, I'm going to have to leave you at prayers
organized chanting of death to America, death to Britain, death to Israel. its head of state is allowed to come to the UN. That's fine by me, but don't let them tell me that only those who criticize them are being blasphemous.
Yep. Well, I have to say that my patience is ending primarily with the United Nations that's arrogant enough to think it should leave us subservient to its collective will. Christopher Hitchens, always good to have you here. Wish we had
Thanks
more time.
for having me back. Okay.
Well, we want to know what you think. Our poll question tonight is, do you believe the United Nations restriction of freedom of speech in the United States should be tolerated? Yes or no? Cast your vote at BlueDobbs.com. We'll have the results here later. 98% of you say the United Nations restriction of freedom of speech in the United States should not be tolerated. And I'm thinking about bulldozers, but that's an addendum.